Interesting. That's so interesting, because right now I'm thinking about it, and I remember a few times in yeshiva where this actually was like brought out, like not to learn it, but like just do it fast, or do it like just go through it. Don't be too much like the iyun, like I just found that very interesting with what you just said. Okay, anyway,
It's probably the origin of that.
probably the origin. Okay, so shifting from the dangerous dead to the sinful dead. The idea that the sinful dead come back to earth as punishment for their sins is completely absent in Talmudic literature. Yet, in Sefer Hasidim, this phenomenon is introduced to us in numerous passages, which details their returning in earthly form and even posing a danger to the living, which you touched upon before. What is the source of this phenomenon in Sefer Hasidim, considering its complete absence in earlier Talmudic literature?
Okay. So the source of this is a mutation of the dangerous dead. In other words, the dangerous dead was a pre-Christian belief. And when Western Europe underwent Christianization, the church modified or channeled this existing belief for its own purposes. And what it did was it mitigated the fear of the dangerous dead to wreak havoc on the living, and channeled it into what they call the sinful dead. That the reason why the dead are disquieted, the reason why they come back to earth, is not to harm the living, but because they haven't gotten atonement, proper atonement for their sin. And therefore they come back, and they come back in a form in which the violence that used to be performed on the living is performed on themselves. And there are visionary accounts, and there are exempla which detail how the sinful dead appears on earth, suffering penance, suffering punishment for the particular sins that they committed. For example, Derek Vitalis, an Anglo-Norman monk, tells a very detailed account of what's called the Troop of the Returning Dead, which was an old pre-Christian, then Christianized notion of what was called Harlequin's hunt, that there was an armed group of soldiers that never did full penance for their sins, and they return and walk the earth endlessly with great pain and great difficulty in atonement for their sin. And he sees this vision of different groups of dead, women who sinned, priests that sinned, knights that sinned. They all walk according to their sort of social class, and the sin that's associated with that social class is obvious through the punishments that they endure. For example, the knights, who are known to be rapacious and murderous of peasants, of others, of church lands, they appear with the instruments of their trade, their weapons, their horses, their spurs, all on fire, so that they're burning perpetually. They're bleeding, they're crying, they're wailing, they're moaning, and they're forced to wander the earth endlessly in search of atonement. And these visions permeated the consciousness of medieval peoples, right? They heard about it. There were spottings of this. This was told, and this belief that people walk the earth in atonement for their sin was absorbed by the Hasidei Ashkenaz. Rabbi Yehuda HaHasid in Sefer Hasidim recounts tales of the dead riding wagons, being pulled by other dead, wailing and moaning for their sins. And he asks the person who sees this sight, asks, who are you? And he says, we are dead and we are suffering for our punishments. And they ask him, what type of sin did you commit? And they said, we committed sins with women. And they have this sort of Sisyphean type of punishment where the ones on top rest and the other ones pull them. And then after a certain amount of time, the ones that are pulling the wagons go on top and the other ones continue. And it sort of continues endlessly. And not just that he cites the story, but he cites the story and appends scriptural verses to it, proving that this thing could happen, that wicked people are compared to animals, because now they have to pull wagons like animals, and the fate of the wicked, he brings verses that connects them with wagons, and he presents it in a way in which he's identifying with this type of punishment, and he actually increases the list of sins that people commit can be punished in this manner. Even though the people who are actually interrogated, the dead, say it's for sins with women, he adds on anybody who acts like an animal in this world will suffer this fate. Anyone who mistreats his animal will suffer this fate. Anyone who puts undue fear upon the living will suffer this fate. So he expands the categories of sinners who will experience this fate. There are other stories that he tells of single individuals who are walking the earth carrying a very heavy load, and are also crying in pain. And when they're confronted by the person who sees them, they ask them, where are you? Why are you suffering? And they said, and this person says, because I stole a certain piece of land, and because I stole an object, now I am perpetually doomed to wander the earth. And we have parallel stories that were circulating in other collections of exempla that tell of a certain person who was seen by another person, and it gives us a name of a person in the, in Germany. I think I can give you his name. Eric Burke, citizen of Andernach, who meets his dead lord Frederick of Kell and sees him carrying this burning hot sheepskin and a heavy load of earth, and his servant asks him, why are you doing this? He says, because I stole a certain this sheepskin from a widow, and I took a patrimony that didn't belong to me, and now I am meant to suffer, to suffer in this way. And this is not to say that the Hasidei Ashkenaz did not believe in Gehenna. Gehenna is the sort of main place for the punishment of the wicked after death that appears in rabbinic literature. And Gehenna is always associated with fire. The Mainstay Korach, those who die from the Korach's rebellion against Moshe, appear in a Talmudic passage. A certain individual, Rabbi Bar is walking in the desert, and a certain guy takes him to a spot in the earth, and he says, here you should know that the dead of Korach are buried underground here, and there's smoke coming up from the earth. So in many statements in rabbinic literature, we understand that Gehenna is subterranean, it's under the earth, and there's fire, and that's how the punishment of the wicked takes place. There are other opinions. One opinion talks about the slinging of a soul in a slingshot, based on a pasuk in Shmuel. Another opinion is that Titus's ashes Titus was burned and his ashes were scattered over the 7 seas. That's another type of post-mortem punishment that the Talmud speaks about. But neither one of those is sort of the accepted opinion, and neither one of those is terrestrial. None of them talk about the dead walking the earth perpetually after death. So that's something that's peculiar and particular to Hasidei Ashkenaz, and you could see it was taken from the environment in which they lived, because there were circulating tales that he clearly adapted and adopted to his Sefer. Rebbe Lazar of Worms, halachist, you'd be surprised. He speaks in his Hilchos Yom Kippurim, in his laws of Yom Kippur. He lists the type of posthumous punishments that a sinner can endure, and he lists Gehenna, and he also says those who are tired out by walking on a thorny path. He believed in this post-mortem walk of sinners. And in his other Sefer, Chachmas HaNefesh, there he speaks about how sinners who sin the same type of sin during their life will walk together in groups on earth. Very similar to that vision that we spoke of earlier, or Derek of Vitalis, that describes the different social classes and their sinners and their particular sins, walking together in groups in a procession. And he says that they will be nav and nad, they will wander like the biblical Cain, which is an interesting association because Cain was a murderer who himself was murdered. So he's a sentence to be nav and nad, to be a wanderer, sort of like the bad dead. But of course, his wandering took place during his lifetime. The novel idea here of Rabbi Eliezer of Worms is that he understands that this punishment will take place after death, that those who sin will wander the earth incessantly in the categories of sins that are similar to theirs. In other words, with sinners that sinned as they did. However, he says they'll only do this 6 days a week, because if they observe Shabbos properly, they will not be made to violate the Tchum Shabbos, he says, which is the distance, right? The certain amount of cubits that a person is not allowed to walk past on Shabbos. The dead will not be forced to walk on earth on Shabbos to violate the Tchum Shabbos. So it just shows you how real these beliefs were for him, that the dead conform to the halachic categories of Tchum Shabbos, notwithstanding the fact that the Gemara says that the dead are chafshim in a mitzvahs, right? Dead do not have to observe mitzvahs. But in his mind, this was sort of, instinctive, that the dead did this walk and that they would not be made to violate the Tchum Shabbos if they observe Shabbos properly in their lifetime. There was a lot of midah keneged midah, a lot of the way you sinned is the way you're punished. So in the same mentality, if they observed the mitzvahs, they wouldn't be punished in a way that reflected their observance of the mitzvah. It's a fascinating.
And to add to that, I think it's interesting that probably over a few centuries later, with Lurianic Kabbalah and all these ideas, that this whole idea of rolling in the snow that you were mentioning before, and even the idea of appropriating the midah keneged midah to reincarnation tends to happen then in the Kabbalistic circles. So it's kind of it's appropriated from this. Clearly, it's appropriated. So I find it to be very, very interesting. And on the next point, I wanted to bring up, because in the Torah, it's very apparent that the Torah opposes anything that has to really do with the rights of the dead, and kind of distances us from the dead, because the priests in the Torah are forbidden to go near the dead, whereas all other pagan religions, that's how they conjured up the spirits and they took advantage of people. The Torah draws a big line in the sand. We can't do that. And not only that, we don't know where Moshe is buried. Like, death culture is really not Torah culture. In fact, the Torah doesn't even mention the afterlife. It barely mentions anything or alludes to it. So interestingly, the Talmudic Sages viewed the cemetery as a place devoid of sanctity, and the living were forbidden from observing the commandments in the presence of the dead buried there. Sefer Hasidim, on the other hand, portrays Jewish burial sites in a way that reflects the notion of a cemetery as a holy place, which we see a lot of people do today. What should we make of this dichotomy?
Okay, so it too, I believe, is a function of the absorption. And again, this is an unconscious absorption. In other words, people weren't making a conscious decision to imitate Gentile ways. This was a subconscious absorption of, religion as culture. Again, that they saw a certain way of behaving and a certain practice, and it became part of their mentality. And we see this in Sefer Hasidim. We see this with the martyrs. The martyrs, especially of the Crusades, right? The Rhineland martyrs in 1096, who gave up their lives rather than be baptized, to the point that they committed suicide in advance so that they wouldn't be baptized, and even killed their children so that they wouldn't be baptized. And there's sort of this quasi, how should I say, very weak halachic ground to allow child martyrdom, to kill one's own children and to commit suicide in these cases. The Rambam is somebody who opposes such behavior, but the Tosafists provide a very weak halachic basis, and and permit it, post facto, of course, but they permit it because in the psyche of medieval Ashkenaz, the martyrs were the holy dead. They occupy a very large place in their consciousness, way out of proportion to how they appear in Talmudic literature. There is some veneration of martyrs, the Asara Haruge Malchus, the 10 that were killed by the Roman Empire. There were those Haruge Beitar and Haruge Lud, the martyrs of Lud and of Beitar, that were spoken about. But we don't find a veneration of them to the same extent that we find in medieval Ashkenaz. There was liturgy that was created to commemorate them. There were fast days created to commemorate them. There were memorial books in which their names were read out loud. And this weak post facto halachic justification for the martyrdom, they translated itself into a veneration of the martyrs. There was a halachic opinion that martyrs do not need to be mourned for, because the belief was they went straight to Gan Eden. They would not go to Gehenna at all, so there's no need to sit Shiva for them. There's no need to have Avelos for them. The psyche was that they had their special portion in the afterlife reserved for the martyrs. And we see this in one of the ghost tales of Sefer Hasidim, in which a would-be martyrs feel badly that they wanted to give up their life al pi kiddush Hashem, but circumstances made it that they didn't have to. And the passage in Sefer Hasidim says, don't worry, anyone who made up in his heart to commit martyrdom will be vouchsafed a portion with me in my partition, meaning you speak a real martyr is speaking here. In other words, they will get that special place designated for martyrs in the afterlife. So martyrdom assumed a veneration Ashkenaz way out of proportion to what it does in the Talmud. And even though the Talmud speaks about certain burial caves reserved for, they have for judges and for pious people, Hasidim, not Hasidei Ashkenaz, the regular kind of pietists, pious people. There is no burial cave for martyrs. There is no specially designated place in the cemetery for martyrs. This changes in the medieval period. First, we have these ghost tales in Sefer Hasidim about one of which tells that a non-martyr bones fell into a mass grave of martyrs. And one of those martyrs comes back in a dream to the members of the town and say, we can't tolerate this person in our midst. This is just not a wicked person. This is just a non-martyr. Shows you that they venerated the burial place of where martyrs were because they wouldn't tolerate any non-martyr. And this is a direct reflection of the exemplar literature that we have, in which Christian saints also come back and tell the living that we cannot tolerate the unworthy buried in our midst. Now, there are examples of this in the Talmud. There's an example that's brought from prophets in which a certain wicked false prophet gets buried hurriedly, falls into the grave of Elisha, the prophet. When the Moabites are advancing and they don't have time to dig him a grave, he sort of ends up on his grave, and he's brought back to life by Elisha, and then they take him and they bury him elsewhere. But here you have a prophet with a false prophet. Okay? In medieval times, we have martyrs with non-martyrs, and these non-martyrs are not wicked. And in the case of Sefer Hasidim, it's even more pronounced because the Christian exemplar, the saints that don't want others buried in their midst, are renegade sinners, are usurers, are people who are, what we'd say, heavyweight sinners. Whereas in the ghost tales of Sefer Hasidim, they're just non-martyrs. They're not necessarily wicked people. And then the flip side of this, we have a ghost tale in Sefer Hasidim in which a certain female martyr her body is carried on a cart, and this is the way they carried the mass dead to the cemetery with other martyrs, and her body falls off the cart. And she appears in a dream to some living person in the town and saying, I want to be buried with the martyrs. She doesn't just demand that she wants to be buried because her body falls off and doesn't, get to be buried, but she asks to be buried with the martyrs. And in Sefer Hasidim, this person, promises a reward to anyone who's going to find this body, and somebody finds the body, and she's brought to burial with the martyrs. And then the story ends that the dead woman comes back a second time in a dream, which is very common in the exemplar literature, and tells this person where a certain treasure is buried, so that he gets rewarded for having made sure that her body gets buried with the martyrs. And this idea of the martyrs having a holy burial place is not just in the ghost tales. We actually know that in 1186, a mentally ill Jew murdered a Christian girl in Neuss, Germany. And this became an uproar in amongst the Christians, that a Jew killed a Christian. And the murderer was buried alive. Other Jews were killed. Others were forcibly converted. And then they took the bodies of the Jews that they killed and they tied them to the wheels of wagons and they left them outside for 40 days.
Oh my God.
When the Jews in the community finally got access to their bodies, they didn't bury them in the nearest Jewish cemetery. They ferried them up the Rhine, a distance of 100 kilometers, so that they could be buried next to the martyrs of the Crusades, 1096. So they felt that these Jews died a martyr's death because they were incriminated because they were Jewish, right? And they suffered because they were Jewish, and they wanted to achieve for them the burial with the martyrs. And this Rhineland mass grave in Xanten became known as Rabbis Valley. And up until the late 17th century, rabbis sought burial near the martyrs' graves. And we have evidence also that there's a person, a Jew named Alexander Wimpfen, who spent an exorbitant amount of money to redeem the body of the Maharami Rutenberg. And he died in jail. And he paid a lot of money to get his body exhumed and brought for Jewish burial. And he asked in return to be buried next to the Maharami Rutenberg. He wanted to be, he writes on his tombstone, so that he could be next to him in paradise as he is next to him in the earth. And this concept of what is known as the holy dead, the martyrs being the holy dead, was a very Christian concept. It was the concept that the saints could plead for ordinary Christians in the time of the final judgment, so that anyone buried near them would sort of share in their sanctity, would be able to secure for themselves a favorable outcome in the afterlife by being buried in proximity to the saints. And the saints were originally martyrs. Early Christianity, only the martyrs were saints. Then Christianity extended it to any holy person in Christianity, especially if they could perform miracles, was considered a saint. So the idea of the martyrs in Ashkenaz becoming the holy dead, and then the space around them was called holy space, was something that was unique to the medieval period. And it was something the Jews unconsciously absorbed, in the sense that they couldn't imagine that their holy dead would be any less holy than the Christian holy dead. In other words, Jews in Ashkenaz had a very strong self-image. They felt that they were the true religion, and they were as holy or holier than their Christian counterparts. And there was a lot of religious competitiveness and tension in medieval Ashkenaz. So even though they're sort of absorbing unawares, Christian notions, they understood the holy the way they did, but they always felt that their holy was holier than the Christian holy, if you would. So it was never a conscious decision to be like the Gentiles. It was more a one-upman, like we are as holy as you are, and then some. And that's how you should perceive, I think, their actions. And the sort of the final nail in this coffin, so to speak, is that the first time the cemetery is referred to in halachic literature as Admas Kodesh, comes from a German halachist, you know, from the medieval time period. That's very telling, that they understood the cemetery as Admas Kodesh because the martyrs are buried here, because the holy are buried here. It becomes Admas Kodesh, and you should pray there because it's Admas Kodesh. So that is very much a medieval inspired understanding, and that has held sway until today.
And I think the development of like sainthood, even in Judaism, it clearly kind of follows this trajectory.
Taking a life of
Because
its own.
yeah, it's taken a life of its own. It's almost like the rabbis have become more and more saintly and more infallible, whereas the Talmudic characters and the rabbis in the Talmud are very much imperfect, and that's the whole point. The reason why we learn from them. So it's very interesting that like the superculture, how much it influences the subculture. You know, it's pretty apparent. So that was really eye-opening. And for the last question, we just wanted to get into sin, penance, and purgation. If you want to ask.
Sure, because a very unique picture emerges in Sefer Hasidim more than any other area in your book. It is in these matters in where it veered away from, if not contradicted, Chazal in a very blatant fashion. What was the rabbinical attitude towards sin and penance in contrast to Sefer Hasidim? And to go even more in depth, it seems that the cultural influence in these matters were highly specific. You explain in your book that it's not popular Christianity which fuels Rabbi Yehuda HaHasid's ideas in these matters, but you attribute it to a very localized and specific influence of an early medieval pre-purgatorial penitent tradition that still persisted in Germano-Christian society of his day. Can you elaborate on this?
That's a very loaded question.
Sorry, long-winded.
Very long chapter in my book, but I will do my best to summarize it. So there is no official doctrine of sin, penance, and purgation in rabbinic literature. As you could see, it's a lot of different dicta that are sort of scattered all over, and I did my best to reconstruct them to come with some kind of cohesive formula. And the mainstay position, the position of Rabbi Akiva that's cited in the Mishnah Edios, which is considered Bechirta. It's the one Mishnah that's considered, we always paskin based on the Mishnah Edios. It has a sort of special status in halacha. Rabbi Akiva says that Mishpat Rishon Begehenem Yud Beis Chodesh, that the sentence, sort of the outer limit sentence for the wicked in Gehenna, and here we're talking about the period immediately after death, is a maximum of 12 months. Obviously, there were, the Gemara speaks about more wicked sinners that are sinners of the most grievous sort, that didn't believe in Tchias HaMesim or denied fundamentals of the faith, or were sinners who caused the public to sin, like Yeravam ben Nevat, right, the biblical king of Israel, who set up the 2 golden calves that became a stumbling block for all of Israel. These very heinous individuals and certain very heinous crimes called Poshe Yisrael Begufan, certain crimes would render one have a sentence that's eternal in Gehenna, right? Gehenna kalim v'hem einan kalim. That Gehenna would end, the Gemara says, but they don't end. Their punishment doesn't cease. So aside from the very heinous sinners, most Jews, and it's sort of the accepted opinion was a 12-month duration. And yet we find in Sefer Hasidim that is not the case. There are 2 tales that tell of somebody who comes back from the dead who's already died many years. And he appears to the living, and his face is all black, or his face is all green. And the living person asks him, "Why do you look this way?" And he says, "Because I'm suffering in Gehenna I'm suffering in Gehenna." And the living person asks him, "Well, why are you suffering?" And he says, "Because," and in each case, it's never a very large sin. It's not murder. It's not adultery. It's not denying the fundamental of the faith. It's always a sin according to pietistic doctrine, meaning what we call lifnim mishuras hadin, supererogatory behavior that's demanded of the Chassid and of the Jew who doesn't know yet. For example, he said the brachos and benching, you better be careful, brachos and benching and tefillah without proper kavana. And here he doesn't mean mystical kavana, but he says that he had his own pleasure in mind and not the pleasure of the Creator. And so this is a very high level sin, and yet he's coming back from the afterlife to say that he's being punished for it. And then the living person says to him, but I thought, and here he's paraphrasing Rabbi Akiva's position, that the wicked in Gehenna only suffer Yud Beis Chodesh for 1 year. How is it that you're there many years? So he answers in a Tosafist-like response, well, the other years were not as harsh a punishment as my first year. That's his response. So he's an educated ghost, and he's also a ghost that parallels similar stories in the example literature. There is a story about a usurer who dies and has to suffer in hell for all eternity, and his widow gives alms and prays and says masses perpetually on his behalf. And he comes back. He's also, looks like he's been tortured in hell. And he says that I've been suffering for 7 years now. It's very harsh, but your prayers have been helping me. And the last 7 years, I've been suffering less. So he also makes this distinction between his first set of years and his second set of years. And then when she continues to pray, then he doesn't come back at all as a sign that her prayers have helped. So you see that the influence of what was believed to occur, that people could suffer for very long periods of time in the afterlife, was something that was absorbed by Sefer Hasidim. And you can't build an argument on one tale. He has another tale in which the same thing occurs. And in addition to that, he makes statements, outright statements, that one should be careful about injury to one's soul, because he creates a kal v'chomer. If one is so worried about injury to a body, how much more so should one be worried about injury to a soul, which will suffer afterwards a yisurim, a pain, she'ein sof ve'ein cheker, that is endless and bottomless. So he outright says that the suffering of the soul after death is going to be eternal, and he never makes a distinction about the type of sinner that's going to suffer this. He has several other ghost stories in which people come back from the afterlife suffering with no determinate end. He has these ghost tales of Heliquin's hunt that we talked about, this army of the dead that walks the earth, and they walk the earth seemingly endlessly. There is no end in sight to their torment. And here he differs from even what I was calling the current theology of Christianity, because what happened in the 13th century in Western Europe was what was called the birth of purgatory. It was the rise to prominence of a middle state between heaven and hell, in which some souls could achieve atonement after death if they didn't they didn't fulfill their penance completely for their sins on earth. And this was a revolution in thought about sin, punishment, and the afterlife in Christianity, because until then, most people felt they were condemned to eternal suffering. It was the very few who would be saved, and everybody else who would go to hell, literally, and be damned forever. And the ability to have purgatory, in which there was sort of a menial type sin, it's called the venial sin, actually, which wasn't a mortal sin, and that they could have a finite amount of suffering, and they could be aided in the suffering through the prayers and the alms and the masses performed by the living on their behalf, injected an air of optimism, of hope for many, many Christians at this time. And the ghost tales about the afterlife predominantly were people coming back to ask for help from the living so that they could get out of purgatory. That was the most common exemplum that appeared in the Middle Ages. Now, if you look at that and you compare that to Sefer Hasidim, which has ghost tales, which has borrowed ghost tales, which clearly tells you it's taking information from the example literature, talks about non-Jews and their stories. And yet there is not one exemplar in which somebody is coming back from the other world and asking for help. Nobody is helped in the stories of Sefer Hasidim. That is very telling. So and we have statements from Reb Shmuel HaHasid, his father, in which he also says suffering in the afterlife is beyond, is eternal, can be eternal. And Rabbi Yehuda HaHasid says that we should pray for sinners after their death beyond Yud Beis Chodesh, beyond the 12-month period after their death, which was not the practice in Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz only prayed the Kaddish prayer for 12 months. Well, actually, they do 11 months, right? So they don't assume that they're the most wicked, but it was not beyond a 12-month period. And Rabbi Yehuda HaHasid says, for those sinners who did not observe Shabbos and Yom Tov properly, and again, this is a pietist definition of not observing Shabbos and Yom Tov properly. This doesn't mean they violated the 39 forbidden malachos, prohibitions of the Shabbos that the rabbis made clear to us. Rather, they did not observe it with joy. They only observed it with sadness. Those people you should pray for every Shabbos and Yom Tov, even past the Yud Beis Chodesh, says Rabbi Yehuda HaHasid, which shows you that he believed in eternal punishment. He believed that people will suffer eternally, and they are not renegade sinners. And he makes this clear in a comparison that in another paragraph where he talks about the reason for kisui hadam. Why do we have to cover blood when we shecht an animal? And he says, because there's a great accusation made at the time. The animal didn't sin, and yet you're murdering him and spilling his blood. And the person who's shechting him is somebody, he says, who's filled with sins like blood is red and crimson. And how can we expose blood of an animal that's sin-free by someone who's sinful? And therefore we have a mitzvah to cover the blood. So he perceives as people as being mired in sin, not being able to come out of the burden of sin, and that's why they can suffer eternally in Gehenna. And therefore, what is his suggestion? How do you get out of this? The doctrine of penance, of suffering now. Better to pay now than suffer later. And he goes a step beyond penance for sin, which is something that Ashkenaz adopted, or parts of Ashkenaz adopted. And he says you should employ voluntary suffering. You should suffer with even having nothing to do with sin, just in case, just to forestall this dreaded punishment after death. And Rav Shmuel HaHasid says that you should, do not follow this in your child rearing, please, that you should educate your child towards suffering by giving him small doses of suffering while he's young so that he can handle it when he grows older. And they go on to say that the majority of Jews will spend some time of Gehenna, that punishment in Gehenna, in paradise, exists, and that even if somebody sins one sin, they will suffer for that in Gehenna, along with others who also sinned in that regard. And this is something that outright contradicts rabbinic teaching, because rabbinic teaching is that somebody who's only rov avonos, who has a majority of sin, will go to Gehenna. Whereas according to Rabbi Yehuda HaHasid, even one sin will make someone go to Gehenna, and he will go there together with others, even if he has many maasim tovim and mitzvos to his credit. So he does not, he's not buying, he doesn't feel bound by the idea of rov avonos, of having a majority of sin. And where does this stem from? I think this stems from an absorption of the Christian doctrine of original sin, and the theory of it, the ransom theory of atonement, that only a very great man can, through a lot of suffering, can help atone for the sins of a person. An ordinary human cannot really atone for all his sins. Rebbe Lazar of Worms, in his penitential, prescribes penance for an adulterer, a male adulterer, and he prescribes him a very harsh regimen that he has to fast all the days of his life except for Shabbos and Yom Tov, which again means no meat and wine. He has to bathe in icy water 1, 2, 3 times a day, all the days of his life. He has to live with a hair shirt, which was common to monks and penitents, a very coarse shirt against his body, and do this all the days of his life, and maybe God will forgive him. This is the mentality that the Hasidei Ashkenaz have towards sin. And then I contrasted it with the Tosafists, who understand the same Talmudic statements that speak about punishment in the afterlife. And in each case that the Gemara speaks about eternal suffering, the Tosfos understand it in a way which reduces the sentence of eternal suffering. Okay, and that's very complicated. I can't, describe it here in this forum, but it just shows you a point of contrast where the Tosafists reduce the amount of time spent in Gehenna, embrace openly statements that say the Jews, the fire of Gehenna will never sholate, will never have dominion over Jews, and compares them to a rimon, which has so many seeds. So too Jews are malay in mitzvos kerimon. They take this at face value. This is a statement that never finds its way into Sefer Hasidim. They believe there's the Shabbos rest of souls, that even those that are in Gehenna will rest there. And then they say that all of the decrees, even eternal punishment that the Gemara prescribes to certain very wicked individuals, if they do tshuva before they die, none of this will apply. So they have a very optimistic outlook towards the Jews and their ascent, their ability to do tshuva, even in the case of an adulterer that sires a mamzer, which is something that Rabbi Elazar of Worms was talking about in his case, that said he could never really get atonement for. The Tosafists are able to say that, even if he has a mamzer, if he does tshuva, he'll restore the breach with Hashem, he can do tshuva. We have evidence from the gravestones in medieval German cemeteries that around the 12th century, aside from the normal inscription that said menuchaso kavod, that his soul will rest with the kavod, which is the Shechina, we find menuchaso tehei be'eden. That's the first time that Gan Eden appears in a sizable way on the tombstones. And that reflects the new medieval consciousness about the immediate afterlife, right? The afterlife immediately after death. And one historian feels that it was the Jews' sort of counterclaim to the Christians that we Jews, we go straight to Gan Eden. We don't need to go to purgatory first. And this was sort of the dichotomy that medieval Jews lived with, that they felt as a whole, the Jews were superior to the Christians, and they are going to go straight to Gan Eden. They are not going to go to Gehenna. And if you look at the Jewish tours of hell, which exist at this time, they describe the non-Jews as suffering in Gehenna, and the Jews either don't go there, or only the very renegade Jews go. And one of them says, even Yeravim ben Nevat will get out of Gehenna because he was associated with David HaMelech or so and so. So they show an optimism and a feeling that the Jews will not suffer in Gehenna. And yet, sort of individually, there were Jews who still felt the need to pray for their deceased relatives, to make sure that they weren't suffering in the afterlife. And of course, there was the extreme position of the Hasidei Ashkenaz that most Jews will suffer for very long periods of time, and eternal punishment is extended beyond rabbinic categories of sin. And I don't think that really had a following, that extreme mindset, even though their doctrine of penance was adopted, but that extreme belief that went against rabbinic opinion about the afterlife sort of remained uniquely theirs.
Well, this was so eye-opening, and for everyone listening, again, the book is Final Judgment and the Dead in Medieval Jewish Thought. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, hopefully you inspire people to get back to the fundamentals of Judaism. I think this is what we got from it.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, and hopefully, one day we get to do this again.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
My
We really
pleasure.
appreciate everything. Thank you.
You're welcome.